Assalamu alaikum dear students, I hope you all are well and in the best conditions of your health. So in today's lecture, for the course of medicinal chemistry, today we shall discuss about the introduction to drugs. So the key concept we shall discuss in this lecture are what are the drugs, what's the difference between drug, medicine and poison, and how we classify drugs. So firstly we'll consider about what is the medicinal chemistry. Right, so medicinal chemistry is actually the application of chemical research for the synthesis of drug, right? So prime purpose of medicinal chemistry is to synthesize drugs. So previously, in the earlier stages when the medicinal chemistry was not much developed, scientists were primarily concerned with the isolation of drugs found in plants. So before that there was nothing like the synthesis of drugs, but in today's world the scientists are not only concerned with the isolation of drugs from the plants, but they are also focusing on synthesis of new drugs. As potential candidates also, they are trying to improve the method of synthesis of existing drugs, right? So why they are trying to improve the method of synthesis of existing drugs? Because the method of synthesis of a drug actually reflects its cost. So if a drug is more expensive, that indicates that its method of synthesis is very expensive, or its method of isolation is very expensive. But if a drug can be easily made, it can be easily synthesized, then the cost of that drug is reduced a lot. So in today's world, the scientists are not only trying to isolate the drugs from natural sources, but they are also trying to synthesize new compounds, and they are trying to improve the method of synthesis of drugs that are already existing and available in the market. So a medicinal chemist works with a team of scientists from different disciplines, and the disciplines include the biologist, toxicologist, pharmacologist, theoretical chemist, microbiologist, and biopharmacist. All of these people from different disciplines, they work together in order to make and develop a drug and to bring it into the market. So these team of scientists, they work together and use very sophisticated analytical techniques to synthesize and test the products in order to develop a cost-effective and eco-friendly method of production. Eco-friendly means something that's environmental friendly. So scientists are trying to make drugs that involve low cost, and also the drugs that make use of production of minimum amount of toxic waste, right? So today the medicinal chemistry deals with the study of already existing drugs. It also deals with the synthesis of new drugs and the study of their biological properties and the study of their structure-activity relationships, right? So the topic of structure-activity relationship will be discussed in the upcoming lectures in near future. So what is a drug? What do we mean by poison, and what is a medicine? So when we say the word of drug, so all that comes into our mind is something that is very addictive, right? So this drug word has a negative connotation, it has a negative feeling. But when we say the drug in terms of medicinal chemistry, that's a very broad definition of drug that includes all aspects. So according to the medicinal chemistry, drug is any chemical other than food that can affect a living process, right? So we are not saying what is the effect, we are saying that any chemical, it should not be food. So any chemical other than food that affects the living process is known as a drug. So if a drug helps the body in a positive way, or if a drug is used for diagnosis, prevention, treatment of symptoms, or cure of disease, then that drug is considered as a medicine. Or if a drug causes a harmful effect on the body, then in that case the drug is a poison, right? So both medicine and poison are drugs. The drug is any chemical that can affect your body, that can affect a living process. So same chemical can be a medicine, can be a poison, depend on the condition of use and the person using it. For example, if you are sick and you are taking a drug, then the drug is helping you to fight the disease. In that case, the drug is acting as a medicine. But if you are taking a drug when you are not sick, right, and you are using the drug in excess, then in that case that drug will cause a harmful effect on you, right? So in that case the drug is acting as a poison. So same chemical can be used as a medicine and can be used as a poison depending on how are you using it and what is the person using it. If a person is sick and using it, then that drug will be a medicine. However, if you are using it in the wrong way, then the same chemical will act as a poison for you. So the use of terms like medicine and drugs are very flexible to cause confusion. It sometimes become very confusing how we can classify whether we can call this as a medicine or we can call it as a poison. How will you say that someone was poisoned by a medicine? Right, that becomes confusing. Poisoned by a medicine. So instead of using the terms of medicine and poison, we prefer the term drug. Right, so in medicinal chemistry we will not use the terms like medicine and poison, we only use the term of drug. Right, so drug means both effects, so anything that can affect your body, whether the effect is positive or negative, so anything that can affect your body, that will be considered as a drug. Now we have about side effect and toxic effect of a drug. Right, so one thing you should know and keep in your mind is that all drugs have the potential to produce more than one response. Right, so if you're taking a drug that is curing your fever, then that drug is not only curing your fever, that is also doing something else in your body. Right, so all the drugs have potential for producing more than one response. So here we are going to discuss about the side effect and the toxic effect. Right, so just for a preview for you, whenever you develop a drug, we studied two aspects. One thing is effective dose 50. So what's effective dose 50? Effective dose 50 is a concentration of a drug which is given to a population of organisms, and this dose causes or cures 50% of the population. Right, so if a dose of a drug cures 50% of the population, then that dose or the concentration of drug is known as effective dose. And we also check the lethal dose of the drug. Lethal dose is what? Lethal dose is that it's the concentration of a drug that's given to a population of organisms, and that concentration kills 50% of the population. Right, so the concentration of drug that kills 50% of the population is known as lethal dose, and the concentration of drugs that cures 50% of the population is called as effective dose. Right, so ideally the effective dose must be lowest and the lethal dose must be higher. मतलब if you take a minimum amount of dose, अगर आप थोड़ी सी ड्रग लेते हैं तो वो आपके ऊपर पॉजिटिव असर करती है, लेकिन अगर आप चाह रहे हैं कि कोई ड्रग पॉइजन के तौर पे यूज़ हो तो आप उसकी कंसंट्रेशन इतनी ज़्यादा लें तो जाके वो नेगेटिव असर करे. राइट, सो आइडियली इफेक्टिव डोज शुड बी लीस्ट, थोड़ी होनी चाहिए, और जो लीथल डोज है इट मस्ट बी ऑफ हायर कंसंट्रेशन कि अगर आप ज़्यादा खाएं तो ये आपको नुकसान हो, अगर आप कम खाएं तो आपको नुकसान ना हो. सो नाउ वी हैव द टू एस्पेक्ट्स, द साइड इफेक्ट एंड द टॉक्सिक इफेक्ट. Side effects are the unavoidable adverse effects of drug appearing at therapeutic dose. So what's therapeutic dose? Therapeutic dose is the dose of effective dose, right? Therapeutic dose वो डोज होती है जो कि आपको क्योर करने के लिए डॉक्टर प्रिस्क्राइब करता है. जो भी आपको डॉक्टर कह रहा है दिन में 1 गोली खानी है या 2 गोली खानी है, ये 1 चम्मच सिरप लेना है, तो ये बेसिकली आपकी थेराप्यूटिक डोज है, और थेराप्यूटिक डोज इफेक्टिव डोज से डिटर्मिन की जाती है. So whenever a doctor is giving you a prescription of a drug, and on that prescription, when you are taking the drug, the adverse side effects observed are known as the side effects, right? The unavoidable adverse effects of the drug are known as the side effects. So also you have observed that doctors say that don't panic, if you use this drug you may feel some allergic response, right? So these are the unavoidable adverse effects. Whenever you are taking a certain drug, you get some adverse side effects, right? So those unavoidable adverse effects are known as side effects, whereas the adverse effects appearing at extreme dose. So if you are taking a very high concentration of a drug, right, then the adverse effects that will be appearing are known as toxic effects. So this is the difference between a side effect and a toxic effect. There is another relevant term which is known as secondary effect. The secondary effect is that, for example, if you say that you are taking a drug and the drug has some antipyretic effect. So antipyretic means that is curing your fever, right? So if a drug is having some antipyretic effect, in addition to this antipyretic effect, this is also curing your inflammation, right? So if a drug has some additional beneficial effect, then that additional beneficial effect is known as secondary effect, right? So you must know about what is a side effect, what is a secondary effect, and what is a toxic effect. Now we go to the classification of drugs. right? So drugs can be classified in four criteria, on the basis of four criterion. So these include classification on the basis of source or origin, classification on the basis of therapeutic use, on the basis of site of action, and on the basis of chemical structure. So just remember that each drug can be classified into one or more of the drug classes. So firstly, we'll consider drugs on the basis of sources, right? So depending on the basis of sources, drugs can be obtained from natural sources, or they may be synthetic, or they may be semi-synthetic, right? So we'll see about all of these classification one by one. So firstly, we have drugs that are obtained from natural sources. So drugs that are obtained from natural sources can be obtained from plants, they can be obtained from animals, they can be obtained from microorganisms, or they can be obtained from minerals. So all of these classes, all of these categories belong to this major category of natural drugs. So if you are obtaining drugs from plants, such drugs are known as plant-based drugs, and they are isolated from various plants, and these drugs are still part of standard therapy. So most of these drugs, they don't have any synthetic substitute, right? Why they don't have any synthetic substitute? The reason is that the plant-based drugs are very complex in their structure. So it's very difficult to synthesize these plant-based drugs in the labs. So most of them, they don't have any substitute, right? So most of them are isolated from plants. They were isolated from plants. The reason being that we are unable to make those drugs in the lab. So examples of plant-based drugs include the vincristine, taxol, digoxin, quinine, reserpine, ergotamine, ephedrine, colchicine. So for your own interest, you can just search for their structure and see how much complex these drugs are. The second category of the natural drugs are the drugs that are obtained from animals, right? So some modern drugs, they are still derived from animal sources because their synthesis is very difficult and very expensive. So examples of animal-based drugs include the gonadotropins, heparin, insulin, thyroid extracts, and certain enzymes. So all of these are obtained from animals. Now we have another third category of natural-based drugs, is that some drugs are obtained from microorganisms. So the use of microorganisms for drug discovery, they started from 1928 when penicillin was discovered from a mold. What's mold? Mold is actually a fungus, right? So penicillin was actually discovered from Penicillium crassigenum. It's name of a fungus, and since its discovery, from this fungus, a large number of antibiotics have been discovered from a number of fungi and some bacteria as well, right? So these drugs are very important. Drugs are very important, and they are important in important as chemotherapeutic agents, which are used against infectious diseases. So examples of the drugs that are obtained from microorganisms include penicillin, streptomycin, tetracycline. The fourth category of natural-based drugs are the mineral or mineral-containing medicated springs, right? A lot of medicinal drugs are obtained from minerals or springs that are containing those minerals. So these include iron, calcium, magnesium, aluminium, sodium, potassium, etc. So these elements are also very useful for medicinal chemistry. Now we have biosynthetic drugs. So biosynthetic drugs are also known as the drugs that are obtained from biogenesis or anabolism, right? So what is that? So biosynthesis is a multiple step enzyme catalyzed reaction in which the substrate are converted into much more complex product by making use of enzymes or by making use of microorganisms, right? So if you are using enzymes or if you are using microorganisms to carry out synthesis of a complex drug, then this is known as biosynthesis. So several drugs are very complex peptides and very difficult to obtain them from natural sources, and also very difficult to prepare them in laboratory because the method of preparation is very expensive, right? So in case if you are trying to prepare some complex polypeptides, then in that case you must look for the biosynthetic method, right? So biosynthetic method that makes use of enzymes or that makes use of engineered microorganisms to carry out the synthesis of complex macromolecules. So examples of biosynthetic drugs include human insulin, interferon, erythropoietin, hepatitis vaccines, etc. So also you can see the structures of these drugs, and you can see how much complex they are and how we can convert them, or we can carry out their synthesis by making use of biosynthetic pathway. And now we have drugs which are semi-synthetic. So semi means half, synthesis means preparation, right? So sometimes it happens that there are complex molecules which we are interested to prepare, but those complex molecules are very difficult and very expensive to prepare. So what we do is that we make use of a starting material which is existing in nature, and we carry out some small simple chemical reaction on this complex molecule, right? By simple reaction of the complex molecule we can get the drug of our interest. For example, we were interested to synthesize 6-aminopenicillinic acid, right? But it's very difficult to prepare this. It is a very complex structure. So what we did, we took penicillin and we took penicillinic acid, and the penicillinic acid was actually isolated from this fungi, the Penicillium chrysogenum, and we carry out just amination of this penicillinic acid, right? The amination of this penicillinic acid yielded 6-aminopenicillinic acid. Now this is simple semi-synthetic process. So in semi-synthetic process what we do is that we make use of a starting material that is existing already in nature, and we carry out simple chemical reaction of that thing. Next we have the synthetic drugs. Synthetic drugs are the drugs that are entirely prepared inside the laboratory. So these drugs are chemically pure, they are rarely available over the counter, and they are very, very inexpensive. The examples are a lot, so I've just summarized a few of them. For example, aspirin, paracetamol, chloroquine, acetyl salicylic acid, chlorpromazine, ephedrine, etc. So all of these are synthetic. They are entirely prepared in lab. So among all of these drugs that are obtained from different sources, the synthetic drugs are most widely used because they are inexpensive. They can be easily prepared on bulk level, and the quality control for these drugs is very easy, and their therapeutic efficacy can be easily modified and improved. Now we have classification on the basis of therapeutic use, right? So on the basis of therapeutic use, the drugs can be classified into a large number of classes. So we have just summarized a few of them here. So we have antiarrhythmics. Anti means against, a means not, rhythm means rhythm. So if there is not rhythm, the drugs that are used for curing that lack of rhythm are known as antiarrhythmics, right? So antiarrhythmic drugs are used to suppress the abnormal rhythm of the heart. Abnormal rhythm of the heart are known as cardiac arrhythmia, right? A means not, rhythm means rhythm, cardiac means heart. So if the heart of rhythm becomes abnormal, then the drugs that are used are known as antiarrhythmics. So the cardiac arrhythmia may be because of atrial fibrillation, they may be because of atrial flutter, ventricular tachycardia, ventricular fibrillation, whatever be the reason of this abnormal rhythm. So the drugs that are used for curing the abnormal rhythm of the heart are known as antiarrhythmics. Next we have anti-anginal, those drugs that are used for reducing the angina pain. Angina is actually the chest pain, right? So those drugs that are useful for reducing the angina pain are called anti-anginal. We have vasodilator. So vaso is short form for vasal, that indicating the blood vessel. Dilate means to open up. So drugs that open up or dilate blood vessels are known as vasodilator. Then we have antihypertensives. So these are used for reducing the hypertension. Then we have the cardiotonics. These drugs tend to increase the efficiency of contraction of heart muscles, right? Then we have hypocholesterol agent. So these, as the name indicates, they are helpful in lowering the cholesterol level. Then we have anti-allergic agents. Then we have drugs that act on the GIT. GIT stands for gastrointestinal tract. Then we have drugs influencing the renal function. So renal means kidney. The drugs that affect your kidney are known as the drug influencing renal function. Then we have drugs that act on the central nervous system. So what's central nervous system? Your brain and spinal cord, they are called the central nervous system. And we have drugs that act on the peripheral nervous system. So peripheral nervous system is all part of nervous system except your brain and spinal cord. So these are few classes of drugs based on the therapeutic use. Then we have classification of the drugs on the basis of site of action, right? So whenever you take a drug, the drug enters into blood, and then drug has to go somewhere to act on, right? The place or the site where the drug acts is called the site of drug action, right? So drugs can be classified according to the nature of site these act on. For example, if a drug acts on a central nervous system, for example a CNS depressant, so CNS depressant will act on CNS. Similarly, if a drug acts on the gastrointestinal tract, its site of action is GIT. However, the system of classification has its limitation because normally the drugs don't act on one site. They always act on more than one site, right? So it means that majority of the drug have effect on several body parts or several body sites. For example, the CNS stimulant cocaine also has some pain reducing effect. So it's not only acting on CNS, it is also acting on some other effect as well, right? So it has a lot of site of action. So a single drug has number of site of actions. So the classification of drugs on the basis of site of action is not of much use. Now we have classification on the basis of chemical structure, right? That depending on the nature of chemical moiety or the nature of function group that is present in a drug, the drugs can be classified into various categories. These include hydrocarbon-based drugs, halogenated drugs, alcohol-based drugs, carboxylic acid-based drugs, drugs having phenol groups, drug having nitro groups, amide, amines, sulfonamide, sulfones, stilbene, thiourea, ingerides. So we shall see about some representative example of each of these. So firstly, we have hydrocarbon-based drugs. So the hydrocarbons have alkyl chain, and the alkyl chain are hydrophobic. So there is no hydrogen bonding possible in the alkyl chains. Hydrocarbon-based drugs are not much used in the medicines because they are toxic. And why they are toxic? Because they are able to cross the blood-brain barrier in most of the cases. So any drug that can cross the blood-brain barrier, that badly affects the brain. So the hydrocarbons are not much used because number one, they are toxic and they are able to cross the blood-brain barrier. So commonly used hydrocarbon-based medicine include the steroid. So this is structure of a steroid here. You can see this is structure of a steroid. So steroids are basically steroids. So commonly used hydrocarbons include the steroids, carotenoids, phenanthrines. Also, paraffin oil is used as laxative. So if you have having a very severe constipation, you are given paraffin oil. So it helps to cure the constipation, right? So these are few examples of drugs that are used, and this belongs to category of hydrocarbon-based drugs. Now we have halogenated compounds. So halogens are hydrogen bond acceptor. Alright, because of their hydrogen bond acceptor ability, they are hydrophilic, means they have affinity for water. Right, so in general, halogenated drugs are hydrophilic. Examples of halogenated drugs include the sevoflurane, desflurane, enflurane, haloethane. So here we have structure of sevoflurane. Here, right. Now we have alcohol-based drugs, so drugs that have one or more alcohol unit in their structure. They are known as alcohol-based drugs. So you know that hydroxy is a hydrogen bond donor as well as acceptor, right? So whenever you have alcohol group in your drug, you can expect that because of the alcoholic functionality, the hydrophilicity of the drug will be increased, right? So more the alcohol group, more the hydroxy group, more will be the water solubility. An example of alcohol-based drug is myoinositol. So here you can see it has 6 hydroxyl groups attached to the 6-membered ring, right? So this is an example of an alcohol-based drug. Now we have carboxylic acid drugs. So carboxylic acid drugs act as hydrogen bond donor as well as act as hydrogen bond acceptor, and as expected, these drugs also increase the hydrophilicity of a drug. Common example of salicylic acid. Also, all the non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, commonly known as NSAIDs, are carboxylic acid drugs. So the carboxylic acid can act as bond donor, hydrogen bond donor as well as hydrogen bond acceptor. However, if you want to decrease the hydrophilicity of the carboxylic acid drug, you can convert it into ester. So ester derivatives are only hydrogen bond acceptors, they are not hydrogen bond donor. So when you convert carboxylic acid into ester derivatives, in this way you can decrease the hydrophilicity of the drug. Now we have phenols as drugs. Phenol-based drugs have dual property. They have a hydrophilic OH group and a hydrophobic aromatic ring. So they have combination of the hydrophilic and hydrophobic groups as well. So depending on the nature of substance that are attached with this phenol, the hydrophilicity and hydrophobicity can be modified. See, a large number of drugs have phenolic unit as part of their structure. For example, you can see this is the Olympicin A, we have aspidinol, we have this structure. So all of these have phenolic group as part of their structure. Next, we have the nitro group based drugs. So the nitro group tends to make the drug more polar and hence hydrophilic. However, it has been observed that drugs that contain the nitro group have some toxicity associated with it, right? So if you have a nitro group in a drug, you can suspect it to be a toxic drug. So normally the drugs don't have nitro group as part of their structure, right? That's not a preferred function group here. Now we have amides and amine based drugs. So amide is having a nitrogen, and that nitrogen is connected with the carbonyl group here. So this is the amide functional group. The amide functional group cannot act as a strong hydrogen bond donor. Why? Because the lone pair of this nitrogen is involved in resonance, and this nitrogen cannot donate electron, right? So it cannot act as hydrogen bond donor, but it can act as a hydrogen bond acceptor because of this carbonyl group. Right, so you can say that amides are not much electrophilic and they are not much hydrophilic. However, if you have a tertiary amine, so normally the amines in the drugs are in the form of tertiary amines, right? The tertiary amines are polar, they are hydrophilic due to presence of free lone pair for hydrogen bonding, and because of hydrogen bonding, so these tertiary amines, they tend to be water soluble. They are hydrophilic. Next we have the sulfonamides and sulfones. So all sulfur containing drugs are collectively known as sulfa drugs. So this sulfonamide and sulfones are very important categories of sulfa drugs. So sulfa drugs, in case if that's sulfonamide, then it has sulfonyl amide functionality. You can see this is sulfonic acid group, and this sulfonic acid group is attached with an amino group. So this is sulfonamide group, and that's a sulfone group, right? So if there is sulfur doubly bonded with two oxygens, right, like this one, so this is sulfone group, right? So sulfone is an analog of a ketone, while sulfonyl amide is an analog of amide, right? So these sulfonamides and sulfones, they are very important sulfur drugs. So you can see these very prevalent, and if you want to see how they are used, you can search for opioids. So whatever the opioids are, so opioids are maximum of the opioids are based on sulfonamides or sulfones, right? So these are important classes of drugs. Next we have the stilbenes. Stilbenes are acyclic olefin. This is acyclic olefin. So mostly on both sides of the double bond we have aromatic rings here. So these are highly hydrophobic, they are highly lipophilic, right? So anything that's hydrophobic means that's water repellent, it is highly lipophilic, right? However, if the groups attached are highly polar, so you can modify the hydrophilic character. If you want to make the stilbene very water soluble, then you can attach some groups that can make it water soluble as well. Otherwise, this basic skeleton of the stilbene is hydrophobic, right? That's highly nonpolar. Now we have classification on the basis of structure. We have thiourea and uride. So this is the basic skeleton of thiourea, right? This is thiourea, and this is substituted thiourea. So this is sorafenib. Sorafenib is actually a medicine that's available in the market, and that's based on this thiourea function group here. And here we have uride. So what are urides? If you have a urea and the urea is acetylated or acylated, right? Here you have urea, and this nitrogen of the urea is acylated, right? So acyl urea are known as urides, right? So urides are also a very important class of drugs, right? So this is classification of drugs on the basis of the functional groups that are present, right? So today we have discussed about what are drugs. The drugs are anything or any chemical that can affect a biological system, whether the effect is positive or negative. Next we saw what's the difference between a poison, medicine, and a drug. Also we saw about what do we mean by secondary effect, side effect, and toxic effect. Then we saw about the classification of drugs on the basis of their site of origin, on the basis of their source of origin, on the basis of their site of action, on the basis of their therapeutic effect, and now we have seen the classification of drugs on the basis of their chemical structure. I hope you have understood this lecture well, and thank you very much for your attention.